Hey guys, tonight we're drifting back to the Middle Ages. So, dim the lights, grab a blanket, and maybe a warm drink. Because tonight's story is about a job that sounds funny on the surface, but in reality, it was probably one of the most stressful and thankless gigs you could possibly land in a royal court. Yes, we're talking about the court jester. Now, in the modern world, when you think jester, you probably imagine some guy in a silly hat with bells, hopping around, cracking jokes, and maybe juggling. Something like a medieval clown at a birthday party for an especially spoiled noble kid. And sure, sometimes that was the vibe. But most of the time, being a jester was less funny entertainer and more permanently anxious punching bag who was one bad joke away from losing his job or his head. Let's be honest, medieval courts weren't exactly bastions of kindness. Kings and queens were surrounded by sycophants, enemies, schemers, and occasionally a cousin who was also their fiancé. And into this powder keg walks the jester, the one person whose job is literally to make fun of everyone without crossing the invisible line that would get them thrown in the dungeon. That's right, jesters were basically the world's first content creators. They're forced to constantly read the room, figure out what the the king, wanted, and churn out material that wouldn't get them demonetized or executed. Jesters weren't just made up by medieval Europe. Versions of the fool show up in lots of cultures. Ancient China had court entertainers who told jokes, sometimes with more wisdom than the officials. Pharaohs in Egypt liked to keep dwarfs and performers who were expected to amuse them with stories or tricks. Even the Aztecs had something similar. So, if you're looking for proof that rulers throughout history were bored out of their minds, there it is. But in Europe, hey, let's hire a funny guy to distract us from the plague and political murder trend really took off in the Middle Ages. Jesters became standard accessories in courts, alongside falcons, giant banquets, and that one knight who was way too obsessed with jousting. Now, not all jesters wore the full clown gear, the hat with bells, the mismatched outfit. That's more of a Renaissance stereotype. In reality, some were dressed like normal servants. Others were given ridiculous costumes to make them look silly on purpose. A few were even kept because they had physical or mental disabilities, which the royals thought was hilarious. Yes, I know, charming people, those medieval nobles. So, what did a jester actually do? Basically, everything. They sang, they told stories, they juggled, played instruments, performed acrobatics, recited poems, and sometimes even delivered news. They were walking podcasts, stand-up comedians, and news anchors rolled into one, and they didn't even get a Patreon. But their main job, keep the monarch amused. And amused could mean a lot of different things. Maybe the king wanted a funny rhyme about his rival. Maybe the queen wanted a bawdy story before dinner. Maybe the court wanted someone to roast the French ambassador without causing an international incident. All of that fell to the jester. And here's the kicker. They were the only people in the room, technically, allowed to insult royalty. On paper, this gave them a unique freedom. They could make jokes about the king's weight or the queen's in-laws, and everyone would laugh it off. But in practice, one bad joke, one wrong word, and suddenly they were in very real danger. It was comedy with the constant thrill of potential execution. Imagine doing open mic night, but the audience has swords. You might think, okay, but at least they had job security, right? Every king needs a laugh. Well, not really. Jesters were disposable. If they failed to be entertaining, they were replaced. If the king got bored, they were replaced. If someone else came along who was funnier, they were replaced. It was the medieval version of being ghosted by your boss. Worse, they were often dragged into politics. A clever jester could sometimes make sly comments about court corruption or bad decisions, which the king might actually tolerate because it came disguised as a joke. But if someone else in the court felt insulted, suddenly the jester was the one overstepping. So imagine the tightrope. Be funny, but not too funny. Speak truth, but not too much truth. Make fun of the king, but only in a way the king finds flattering. Basically, the world's most toxic HR handbook. Let's float over to some real names. Because yes, we actually know a few. One of the most famous was Will Somers, who served Henry VIII of England. Now, Henry VIII was not exactly known for his chill personality. This was a man who had 6 wives, and somehow managed to execute 2 of them. So, imagine trying to crack a joke in that environment. But Somers somehow pulled it off. He was one of the very few people who could make fun of the king to his face without getting executed. Henry actually kept him around for decades. And even in his declining years, Somers was apparently one of the only people who could lift his spirits. Then there's Triboulet, the jester for King Francis I of France. He was sharp-tongued, clever, and famously walked the line between comedy and death sentence. Once, he insulted a powerful nobleman so badly that the man demanded he be executed. Francis I, being amused, offered Triboulet a choice of how he would die. Triboulet, quick as ever, replied, "By old age." The king laughed and let him off. So, yes, occasionally, sarcasm actually saved your life. But not everyone was so lucky. A lot of jesters fade into the record because, well, they weren't funny enough to survive. If you bombed on stage, you didn't just get awkward silence. You got unemployed. And in medieval times, unemployed often meant starving peasant. Here's a darker side. Not all jesters were professional comedians. Some were what they called natural fools. These were people with developmental disabilities, mental illness, or physical conditions, kept around the court to amuse the royals simply by existing. They weren't trained performers. They were exploited because nobles found them entertaining. So yes, being a natural fool meant you might get a roof over your head, but it also meant you were stuck in a court as everyone's living joke. The cruelty of it was staggering. But at the time, no one saw it as cruel. They saw it as having their own personal pet human. It's bleak, and it shows just how low the dignity of a jester could be. So, let's recap why being a medieval jester wasn't nearly as fun as it sounds. You were constantly under pressure to perform. You could lose your job instantly if you bored the king. You could be punished if you accidentally offended the wrong noble. Your entire life revolved around making sure other people were amused, even when you weren't. And even if you were good, your role was still seen as ridiculous, never respectable. Basically, being a jester was like living in permanent job probation while wearing bells on your head. And that's just the beginning, because tonight, after floating through the rough life of jesters, we'll drift further into the medieval courts themselves, the bizarre jobs people had, the things nobles forced servants to do, and why royal employment was often more nightmare than dream. But let's not rush. Let's stay with the jester for just a little longer, because while they were mocked, they sometimes had one rare advantage. They could speak truths no one else dared say. In that way, the fool was occasionally the smartest one in the room, even if he was also the most miserable. All right, so we've tucked ourselves into the soft candlelight of part 1, and we've met the jester, the supposed funny man of the Middle Ages who, in reality, lived in constant low-level terror of unemployment or beheading. But before we wander away from him entirely, let's stretch out the conversation, because the role of fool wasn't just about comedy. It was tangled up with court culture in ways that made it even weirder and often even sadder. You've probably heard that old phrase, "The fool is the only one who can tell the truth to the king." And yes, there's a little truth to that, but don't imagine medieval monarchs sitting there nodding thoughtfully while the jester delivered TED Talks about social reform. In reality, the truth was usually slipped in sideways, under layers of rhyme, sarcasm, and fart jokes. If a noble was corrupt, the jester might hint at it with a silly story about a donkey stealing apples. If the king was wasting money, the jester might sing a little tune about an empty purse and an empty stomach. Everyone in the room would chuckle. The king would smirk, and maybe, just maybe, a tiny message landed. But here's the twist. If the king didn't like the truth, it wasn't noble courage. It was just suicide by sarcasm. So, yes, jesters had this reputation for speaking freely, but in practice, they were still just dancing on eggshells. Now, imagine the actual work. Jesters weren't just cracking jokes. They were expected to perform constantly. Court life was boring. Like, really boring. Hours of ceremonies, feasts that went on forever, endless political meetings that sounded like badly written soap operas. And to keep everyone awake, the jester had to jump in and perform. That meant tumbling, juggling, acrobatics, and playing multiple instruments. Basically, they were unpaid variety show hosts who never got to clock out. And remember, this was a time before Advil, before chiropractors, before modern medicine. If you pulled a muscle doing backflips for the Duke, you just limped around until you healed. Or you didn't. And if you couldn't perform anymore, you were tossed aside. So yes, the jester's bells jingled, but a lot of the time, those bells were covering up sore muscles, aching bones, and pure exhaustion. Something else people don't realize. Jesters were often treated less like employees and more like pets. The royals would dress them up, make them do silly tricks, even parade them around to impress guests. They weren't respected performers. They were accessories. Some kings even gave their jesters humiliating nicknames, like Little Man or Simple Jack, and would introduce them like toys. It wasn't uncommon for jesters to be forced into embarrassing situations, like being the butt of cruel jokes, or worse, being made to fight with animals for amusement. One account even suggests that a German duke had his fool made to fight a bear, which is about as funny as being hit with a brick. Here's where it gets spicier. Jesters weren't just court clowns. They were sometimes political tools. A clever monarch might use a fool to make fun of an enemy in a way that looked harmless. Like, "Oh no, it wasn't me mocking your terrible haircut. Mr. Ambassador, it was just my jester being silly. Don't take it personally." This meant the jester could be used to test boundaries, plant ideas, or insult rivals without the monarch having to take responsibility, which sounds useful until you realize it also meant the jester was always the scapegoat. If a joke went wrong, if a guest stormed out in anger, the fool was blamed. Basically, you were the medieval version of "don't shoot the messenger," except sometimes they did shoot the messenger. Now, let's talk about the human side. Being a jester wasn't exactly glamorous. You weren't seen as an equal to the court. You weren't even really seen as a servant. You were in this weird limbo. Everyone laughed at you, but no one took you seriously. That meant you had very few friends. The nobles looked down on you. The servants didn't trust you, and the royals treated you like furniture with legs. It was isolating. And remember, most jesters weren't chosen because they loved comedy. A lot of them ended up there because they were orphans, disabled, or otherwise considered unfit for normal labor. The court snapped them up and turned them into entertainment. So, not only were they mocked daily, they also had nowhere else to go. It's a sobering thought. Behind the bells and juggling, a lot of jesters were probably deeply unhappy. Here's the ironic part. Despite their precarious status, some jesters outlasted the kings they served. Will Sommers, the one who worked for Henry VIII, actually stuck around through the reign of Edward VI, Mary I, and even Elizabeth Theis. That's 4 monarchs, all while keeping his position as the fool, which is kind of impressive, considering half the nobility couldn't survive more than 1 tutor before losing their heads. It's proof that if you were just funny enough, just harmless enough, and just clever enough, you could carve out a weird kind of job security. But again, that was rare. For every Will Sommers, there were dozens of nameless fools who didn't make it into the history books because they didn't juggle their way into royal favor. Now, we could drift forever among the fools, but let's gently expand, because the jester wasn't the only poor soul stuck in medieval court life with a miserable job. Oh no, if anything, the fool might have had it slightly better than some others. Take the royal food taster. Sounds luxurious, right? Eating the king's meals? Except, the whole reason the job existed was because poisoning was a constant fear. So yes, congratulations, you get to eat royal banquets. But if there's poison in the pie, you're the first one dead. And here's the best part. The king didn't even have to wait to see if you keeled over. Sometimes they just assumed you'd catch the poison instantly. Imagine sitting there thinking, this chicken tastes funny, and realizing it's your last thought ever. Then there was the groom of the stool, a very real position in England, whose job was literally to help the king use the bathroom. And yes, stool means exactly what you think it does. This wasn't a servant cleaning up after the king. It was a trusted role, because it meant being alone with the monarch in a vulnerable moment. But trusted or not, your life's work was essentially wiping royal butt. Not exactly something you bragged about at family reunions. And let's not forget the ladies-in-waiting who had to hover around queens all day, watching them eat, sleep, dress, and even give birth. It was less like being a friend and more like being a human surveillance camera. So yes, being a jester was humiliating, but medieval courts were full of humiliating jobs. Everyone was there to make the royals comfortable, no matter how degrading it was. Now, you might ask, why did royals keep fools around at all? Why not just have musicians or actors? The answer is, because the fool was a living symbol of power. By keeping someone who was dressed ridiculously, mocked constantly, and kept around purely for entertainment, the monarch was showing off. Look how powerful I am. I have a human pet. It wasn't about joy. It was about dominance. The fool was the ultimate flex. So, to wrap this little drift, the medieval fool lived in contradictions. They were free to speak truth, but only within strict limits. They were valued, but never respected. They were constantly present, but always alone, and their whole life depended on keeping moody, unpredictable royals in a good mood. That's why it sucked. The laughter wasn't for them. It was at them. And while history remembers them as comic relief, their real story is a quiet tragedy of people trapped in roles they couldn't escape. And as we sink deeper into the candlelight of tonight's tale, we'll drift next into more of those strange medieval court jobs, the tasters, the stool grooms, the ceremonial flunkies, each one stranger, sadder, and more thankless than the last. But for now, rest on the thought that the next time you see a cartoon jester in a silly hat beneath the bells and bright colors was often a very tired, very anxious person, desperately trying to make a king laugh before it was too late. So, we've spent some cozy time with the court fool, bells jingling, nerves fraying, juggling his way through humiliation, and you'd think, surely, no other medieval job could be quite that miserable. But the truth is, medieval courts were essentially giant pyramids of awkward servitude. And if you weren't wearing a crown, chances are you were stuck doing something you'd never put on your medieval LinkedIn profile. Let's start with the poor food tasters. On paper, it almost sounds like a dream job. Endless banquets, roasted boar, spiced wine, candied fruit, meat pies dripping with fat, and bread that wasn't made out of sawdust, but here's the fine print. You were eating to see if it killed you. Poison was a constant fear in royal courts. Nobles were always scheming, and slipping a little something extra into the king's soup was a convenient way to settle power struggles. So, the food taster's role was simple. Take the first bite, wait a moment, and prove the dish was safe. Now, in theory, this meant the king was protected. In reality, it just meant the taster lived in a constant state of culinary paranoia. Every meal was Russian roulette with gravy. Imagine biting into a delicious venison pie, pausing and thinking, is this nutmeg or nightshade? And worst of all, it didn't always work. Some poisons were slow acting, so by the time the taster keeled over, the king was already halfway through his second plate, which meant not only did you die, you also failed at your job. A lose-lose situation, if ever there was one. Now, if the food taster's job was terrifying, the groom of the stool was just degrading. And yes, we're about to get into medieval toilet talk. The groom of the stool was an official position in England, and despite what it sounds like, it was not considered lowly. In fact, it was weirdly prestigious, because the groom's job was to help the king go to the bathroom. Yes, literally help. He brought the chamber pot, assisted with undressing, and made sure everything was, let's say, taken care of. And while this sounds horrifyingly intimate, it also meant the groom was one of the few people who got daily, private time with the monarch. That meant influence, trust, and sometimes even political power. But at the end of the day, no matter how respected you were, your job was still cleaning up royal business. Imagine explaining that at dinner. Ah, yes, I'm the closest confidant of the king, because I wipe his behind. It's the kind of position that summed up medieval courts perfectly. Power and humiliation mixed together in the same chamber pot. Then there was the keeper of the wardrobe. Sounds nice, right? Clothes, fabrics, jewels. Except medieval monarchs owned hundreds, sometimes thousands, of outfits. Every robe, every cloak, every jeweled slipper had to be maintained, repaired, perfumed, and catalogued. It was like running a dry cleaner for a customer who never wore the same thing twice. And because clothes were political, colors and fabrics carried symbolic meaning, you couldn't mess up. Accidentally give the king a robe with the wrong embroidery, and suddenly you'd caused a scandal. Nobles might whisper that the monarch was sending secret signals, or worse, looking unfashionable, which in medieval royal terms was practically treason. So yes, your life was a never-ending laundry cycle, and considering that medieval hygiene was questionable, let's just say those robes probably smelled less like lavender and more like a damp cellar full of wet dogs. Another unlucky figure was the court barber surgeon. Now, you might be thinking, wait, barbers and surgeons were the same thing. And yes, because why not double down? In the Middle Ages, if you could hold a razor, you could cut hair and cut flesh. 2 for 1 special. Barber surgeons did it all: shaving, trimming beards, pulling teeth, setting broken bones, and of course, the classic medieval treatment for everything: bloodletting. Got a fever? Drain some blood. Headache? Drain some blood. Depression? You guessed it. Drain some blood. So, imagine being summoned to the palace, not knowing if today you were going to give the Duke a nice trim, or amputate his infected toe with the same blade. And remember, there was no anesthesia, which meant your client was screaming in your face the entire time. For women, one of the most common court positions was the lady-in-waiting. It sounds elegant, like you're a companion to the queen. But, in reality, it was glorified babysitting. Ladies-in-waiting dressed the queen, watched her eat, sat through her prayers, accompanied her on trips, and basically existed as a living furniture. You weren't allowed privacy, because queens weren't allowed privacy. You shared her boredom, her moods, her drama. And if she got angry, you were the target. And let's not forget, queens were political pawns, which meant being a lady-in-waiting was like living inside a soap opera, where marriages, betrayals, and executions were weekly plot twists. One day you were holding a fan for a smiling princess. The next day, she was accused of treason, and you were expected to testify against her. Cozy. Now we need to touch on something darker. Many courts kept people with dwarfism, disabilities, or unusual appearances, treating them as curiosities. These individuals were sometimes given positions similar to jesters, not because they were trained entertainers, but because nobles thought their physical difference was amusing. Some were treated relatively well, given clothes and a salary. Others were treated horrifically, mocked, dressed up as playthings, and even forced into humiliating performances. It's a bleak reminder that court life was built on power imbalances. Someone always had to be the butt of the joke, and if it wasn't the jester, it was someone even less fortunate. And then, beyond the specialized roles, there were hundreds of nameless servants filling the halls. Cooks, who worked in smoky kitchens from dawn till midnight. Pages running back and forth carrying messages. Stable boys shoveling manure for horses they weren't even allowed to ride. Maids scrubbing chambers where nobles tracked in mud, and worse, all of them living in the shadow of the monarch. All of them knowing they were replaceable. The court may have been filled with gold and jewels, but most people inside it were just tired, underpaid, and hoping not to get yelled at by a duke with gout. Here's the strange part. Despite all the humiliation, danger, and exhaustion, people still wanted court positions. Why? Because in a world where peasants lived short, brutal lives in the fields, working in a palace, even as a fool or stool groom, meant food, shelter, and proximity to power. You weren't respected, but you weren't starving either. It was survival, dressed up as privilege. So, when you look at all these jobs together, the tasters, the stool grooms, the wardrobe keepers, you start to realize the jester wasn't an oddity. He was just another cog in the machinery of humiliation that kept medieval courts running. The difference was, at least he got to laugh, even if the laugh was hollow, even if the joke was forced, even if the bells jingled louder than his own thoughts. At least for a moment, he had the illusion of freedom. And maybe that's why people remember him more than the others. The fool, in all his absurdity, symbolized the truth of court life. Beneath the silks and crowns, everyone was miserable. And as we slowly close this chapter of the night, we're not finished yet. Because if jesters and stool grooms suffered in the courts, imagine what was happening outside the palace walls, where peasants toiled, soldiers fought, and entire lives revolved around serving people who thought entertainment meant mocking the disabled. But let's save that for the next drift. For now, we'll rest with the image of the medieval court as it truly was, a glittering cage filled with tired servants, anxious fools, and monarchs who demanded laughter while everyone else quietly endured. And so, the life of a medieval jester wasn't the colorful fairy tale most people imagine. Behind the bells and laughter was constant fear of ridicule, poverty, and punishment if they crossed the wrong line. They were entertainers, yes, but also survivors walking a razor's edge between amusement and humiliation, privilege and danger. In many ways, they remind us that history's funny men often carried some of the darkest burdens. So the next time you picture a jester dancing in a royal court, remember, it probably sucked a lot more than it looked.